Hey, fuckers. Here's the thing. While this may feel a bit like beating a dead horse, we're still whipping. Uh, We were supposed to be done with this series, hitting real world, accessible micro behaviors that can help with the peri and post trauma period. Then, tumbling into talking about relational varieties of trauma once more. And instead of that work being released this morning, hey, look what paper showed up after I requested it from my institution several weeks ago. Risk factors for the development of psychopathology following trauma. So, it's really the review article that seemed most relevant when I started this series in that strange void of quality research on the topic. And now it has arrived. Could it have come sooner and saved the effort of discussing about 5 other papers to get to this point? Sure. Also, huzzah for more information, because it is revealing, paper by paper, what really matters in PTSD prevention. Not necessarily through what they tell us, but through thinking about what they tell us when it's all patchworked together. So, today, let's talk about the pre traumatic, peri traumatic, and post traumatic risk and resilience factors for developing PTSD. Concisely. If you want more details, I'll also be releasing a longer version with longer discussions of each point. Check out those advanced tiers. Then we will finally wrap on this series that no one asked for, just like trauma. But before we start, thrice points. Number 1, psychopathology does not mean psychopathology. It means unsafe or disruptive or less functional conditions of the mental state. Number 2, doesn't all of this regular PTSD reporting sound a lot like complex PTSD? Relational PTSD? It does. And don't worry, because we'll be talking about the crossover next. And lastly, I hope that during this cut and dry PTSD discussion, you have also been running through your own recovery efforts from your various traumas and abuses. Perhaps seeing why some trauma rebounds have been much smoother than others. Maybe taking notes of what went wrong or right to help yourself more compassionately, and maybe to release some judgment that you've been carrying. Hey, it's not your fault if you've previously made moves that are now reported as more likely to produce PTSD. A good deal of the time, the information runs counter to cultural, quote, wisdom about what to do, right? Keep going. Drink the pain away. Don't revisit the negative events. Now we know better. So now we can direct ourselves with less PTSD disturbances and hopefully spread the word. So here it finally is. Risk factors for the development of psychopathology following trauma by Sayed, Iacovelio, and Charney. As usual, none of those were pronounced right, and they wrote this back in 2015. Let's get to the bottom of this series, integrating everything we know. They tell us, although a staggering 89.7% of Americans are exposed to a significant traumatic event over the course of their lifetime, The majority of trauma-exposed individuals do not develop psychiatric disorders. PTSD is not an inevitable result of trauma exposure, as a relatively small percentage of those exposed develop PTSD. As PTSD is often considered the most severe manifestation of post-trauma psychopathology, this review will focus more specifically on the risk factors for developing PTSD and associated psychopathology in response to trauma exposure. Let's jump into the pre-traumatic factors, aka life conditions that make us more vulnerable so that trauma is more impactful when it hits. First one, gender. Females developed PTSD about twice as often as males. The lifetime prevalence rate of PTSD for women is 8.5 and 3.4% for men. We have to pause immediately and say reported prevalence rate. That corresponds with seeking mental and emotional help, which is pretty much always going to be a point of difference between the sexes, at least historically speaking. Generally, males report more traumatic exposures, but females are exposed to more sexual trauma and are more likely to develop PTSD. Okay, stopping again. Surviving a big T trauma like war or natural disaster is going to be socially easier, more connective, and more positively egoed, generally speaking, than reporting a sexual trauma. So without having that social support and processing ability, you're going to be more likely to get PTSD. Women with PTSD also experience symptoms longer than men and are more likely to report poorer quality of life. Okay. So taking all of that together, if life changes drastically after the trauma with a negative downturn, then the cognitive and emotional trauma aftermath becomes more serious, more dire, because mentally the experience is extended and it's also deepened to have a greater, more destructive meaning. So, women exposed to more sexual trauma, which is poorly discussed, it's impossible to environmentally clear away since it is attached to the body, and it often comes with shame, blame, guilt. All of this is so pervasive that it is, in a way, difficult to consider being a woman isn't kind of a covert trauma all its own. Then the sexual trauma comes in, and you're told, you are disgusting. Just look at yourself, but don't talk about it. And in reporting a lower quality of life, it's not difficult to see how the mind can connect that sexual trauma and that ongoing shame of being a woman as the causation for that poorer life quality, and may even place blame on the victim. None of this is news to us, right? Stereotypically speaking, men can be celebrated for their big, bad trauma survival. Women are often facing a different brand of trauma, and overall, not so much celebration. Much more silencing, fear, and shame. Also, I maintain that women are more likely to face negative twists and ramifications in life by being social underdogs in the aftermath, which I believe we often realize before any trauma happens, so that pre-trauma, they're already chronically stressed with an awareness of a somewhat precarious position in society. They continue. In a recent quasi-prospective study assessing PTSD in Danish bank employees exposed to bank robbery, the authors found that females reported more PTSD symptoms than males. The researchers contribute a combination of pre, peri, and post-traumatic risk factors such as neuroticism, depression, physical anxiety sensitivity, peritraumatic fear, horror and helplessness, panic, disassociation, tonic immobility, post-traumatic cognitions about self and the world, and feeling let down together accounted for 83% of this effect of sex on PTSD severity. Okay, that's significant. 83% of this gender difference might be due to these ongoing stress responses that women seem to be more prone to. I think many of these things exist commonly because of, again, the inherent danger and dismissal of being a woman in our social constructs. Women are told that they are weaker, less capable, more at risk, and more likely to receive damage, not accolades, in traumatic situations. So when a violent one presents itself, sure, they're physically and mentally fearful as a normal biological response. And then also reminded of exactly how relatively powerless they are socially, societally. Post-traumatic cognitions about self and the world is a risk factor, they say. I think they're describing what is often little more than the knowledge and actuality of societal and gender-based vulnerability in the female sex. Age. The highest lifetime prevalence of PTSD was in a group of 45 to 59-year-olds, 9.2%, and the lowest prevalence, 2.5%, was in the group over 60 years old. Okay. This finding doesn't tell us jack shit. Uh, Without monitoring the same individuals over time, this information means nothing. At an advanced age, is trauma just another drop in the bucket of experience, so there's less of a reaction to it? Or are they saying that as we get older, we stop recalling our traumas? Or are they saying that generationally, boomers are less likely to report having PTSD? Uh, Can't tell. The citation does not help clarify anything. It certainly doesn't discuss differences between the age groups in the acceptability of mental disordering or probability of reporting such things. So, this is just not helpful, or probably a very real finding. And I will leave it there. On to a point that we briefly touched on last time, but with a more helpful expansion on that information this time. They say education slash IQ. Education is strongly correlated with IQ, and IQ has been shown to be inversely correlated with the risk of PTSD and other psychiatric disorders. Breslau and colleagues reported that children who had an IQ greater than 115 at 6 years old had a decreased risk of PTSD after a trauma exposure. Consistent with these results, it has also been reported that IQ assessed at age 5 was inversely associated with the risk of developing PTSD at age 32. In a 17-year prospective study, researchers concluded that overall, high IQ protected trauma-exposed individuals from developing PTSD. Well, this is better information than, quote, educated men are protected. Because hasn't education and the ability for cognitive reappraisal significantly affected your PTSD? If we're able to think about things from multiple angles, especially through integrating new information, yeah, of course, we're more likely to resolve PTSD or to move on from it with an understanding rather than getting stuck in one rigid story of doom. And also, I have to report, intellect allows people to analytically disregard their PTSD in a lot of ways. The number of fuckers who can report on their progress without actually making any progress is significant. So high IQ is perhaps not necessarily protecting people from PTSD, but could be protecting them from being obviously impacted by it or displaying the symptoms of it. Lastly, again, though, beyond both of those considerations and at the core of this whole conversation, IQ is often tethered to societal privilege. Better nutrition, better caregiving and education experiences available to you. Yeah, you're going to be hitting or surpassing developmental milestones and building a stronger cognitive capacity. So, IQ is probably indicative of many life factors that can prevent or prime us for PTSD, such as resources, opportunities, and social support. These things are also being measured, not just intelligence in their measurements. Just like this next point. Race and ethnicity. Researchers found that the lifetime prevalence of PTSD was highest among Blacks, 8.7%, intermediate among Hispanics and whites, 7 and 7.4%, and lowest among Asians, 4%. These results are consistent with previous studies reporting whites have higher risks of exposure to any traumatic event. Although whites were more likely than the other groups to have any trauma, among those who were exposed to trauma, PTSD risk was slightly higher among Blacks and lower among Asians compared with whites. Okay, once more, PTSD is highest among those who have had, historically and generally still to this day, the worst time in society. Please refer to everything already stated about women. That at least in this country, any minority group is probably at a higher risk of PTSD due to their awareness of social vulnerability and the unfortunate reality of that knowledge. Physically, they're more in threat. Mentally, there is additional stress from this knowledge. And you can refer here to the prevalence of the talk in American Black culture, for instance. As far as whites reporting the most traumas, well, again, reporting is possibly the problem. Whites may interpret more events as being traumatic. They may have more resources to seek treatment, as well as more cultural acceptance of mental health matters, and thus appear to make a larger impact on those stats. And lastly, not to generalize too much about a race that I am not a part of, but considering the cultural focus on honor, strength, and achievement, Doesn't it make sense that Asian populations might report less PTSD than everyone else, even as minorities? I worked in biomedical research academia. The things I saw many, if not most, of my Asian peers putting themselves through was, to me, traumatic, abusive, self-abandoning. To them, just doing what they were supposed to do. If their narrative isn't negative, will they develop PTSD? It's less likely. Sexual orientation. Several studies have found elevated prevalence of both childhood maltreatment and adulthood PTSD in sexual orientation minorities. Lesbians, gay males, and bisexuals, referred to as sexual minorities, experience higher rates of early childhood abuse and greater exposure to violence and traumatic events. Sexual minorities have been reported to have a 1.6 to 3.9 times higher risk of PTSD compared to a heterosexual reference group. Okay, so that's enormous, right? Between 1.6 and 3.9 times higher risk of PTSD. So, to me, this report is stating, similar to women, that there are more childhood abuse events for sexual minorities, and that alone could be a massive cause of the increased chance of PTSD. Then, on top of the point-blank early exposure to abuse, which we'll find out soon is a risk factor for later PTSD, this is another at-risk group in global society. They're aware of it. They've already experienced it, personally or through observation, by the time adolescence hits. And thus, they recognize that it takes a far weaker breeze to blow their lives to dust as compared to hetero counterparts. C. The crossover between homosexuality and houselessness, especially in teens and young adults. Taking a tumble often puts them in additionally compromised positions, culminates in more risk factors, and perhaps poorer life outcomes. This again extends the story of the trauma, and it creates a sense of having a target on one's back forever, for their very identity. So that's some PTSD material. It's pretty stressful to feel unallowed to exist, period. Pre-trauma psychopathology. The psychopathology of an individual prior to the trauma has also been implicated as a risk for developing PTSD. Children rated as having externalizing problems above the normal range at age 6 were more likely to develop PTSD than children who are rated as normal externalizers. Likewise, children who were categorized as highly anxious or having depressive mood in first grade were also at higher risk of PTSD at age 15 when exposed to traumatic events. Children with difficult temperaments, fewer friends, or antisocial behaviors were more likely to develop PTSD than their peers who did not have these characteristics. First of all, externalizing problems are behavioral issues characterized by acting out on the external environment, such as aggression, impulsivity, rule breaking, hyperactivity, bullying, and conduct problems. They are a distinct category from internalizing problems, which involve inward focused issues like anxiety and depression. And the authors also said that children with anxiety and depression were at an elevated risk as well. Children who aren't thriving are often in some way in a state of surviving, which we know can mean every second of their little life is stressful. It's threatening. It's risky. Then a trauma enters the picture. Sure, crank that stress level up to 20 as the child takes it as a personal punishment or indication of wrongness, which, left untreated, isn't going anywhere for the next, I don't know, 80 to 85 years. That's lifelong CPTSD. That's how many of us got here. And if we're baseline equipped with anxiety or depression, of course, another layer of it imparted from a traumatic event is going to be more serious than if starting from zero, contributing to increased stress and depressive events. It will make a much larger impact on the kiddo compared to the norm. Lastly, they said, children with difficult temperaments, fewer friends, or antisocial behaviors were more likely to develop PTSD. This is all suggesting the same things again. A lack of social support is available pre, peri, and post trauma, probably starting in the family and cascading into their peer connections, which is another inherent, ongoing threat to the brain. The child already is in a difficult position, behaving, quote, incorrectly because something is happening for them psychologically. And then after additional stress is piled on, being socially isolated is a hindrance to processing the trauma or safely emoting about it. Similarly, another pre-traumatic factor is prior trauma exposure. It is now well known that exposure to prior trauma has been implicated in PTSD. Pre-trauma psychopathology increases the risk. Additionally, childhood abuse is a risk factor. Women who experienced physical abuse during childhood had a higher risk of lifetime PTSD. And additionally, people who experienced a traumatic event before the target stressor reported higher levels of PTSD symptoms than those who did not, especially among individuals who experienced non-combat interpersonal violence. However, more recent studies have shown that it is not the prior trauma experience, but the development of PTSD symptoms in response to a prior trauma that increased the risk of PTSD after a later trauma. So, there's some controversial results in there, but we can say that PTSD breeds more PTSD. Trauma also seems to breed more PTSD. Of course, if you have post-traumatic stress disordering once, your brain is potentiated with thoughts, emotional pathways, and biological factors to have it again. And in a cognitive way, the second or beyond incidents of experiencing an impactful trauma will tell the mind, see, look how dangerous life is. We knew it all along, but here's more evidence. This can keep happening, and there's no reason to believe that it won't, based on this repeated proof. When trauma seems to follow you everywhere you go, it's easy to feel targeted by the world, by the universe, or just by the human population. If you believe you cannot walk outside without being struck by lightning, and you then gather evidence that confirms it a few times over, yeah, um, it's a stressful condition to exist in, which will exponentially increase the impact of any negative event by confirming what the mind already suspects about its vulnerable position of self versus the world. This next point probably adds to all of that strain. Familial psychiatric history. Individual studies have shown that parental mental health disorders are associated with increased risk of PTSD, even after controlling previous traumatic events. Maternal depression has also been shown to be associated with increased risk. Statistically significant associations between PTSD and family psychiatric history of depression, anxiety, and psychosis have also been reported. In addition, recent genetic studies showed that relatives of PTSD patients had higher risk of the disorder than relatives of similarly trauma-exposed controls who did not develop PTSD. This one wraps up everything we've been discussing and then made it a multi-generational issue. If one person realizes that they're at risk for various reasons, gender, race, societal position, and then passes that on to another individual who shares the traits, priming them with stress, and that second individual then has their own experiences, realizing the same vulnerable position is a reality, well, then the story is proven true. The stress is seen as demonstrably correct. The fear of life has been established and then verified. This is how PTSD can be transferred from one generation to another, not only through modeling and protective storytelling, not only through genes, but also in creating similar experiences and mindsets. And there's probably a lack of measured, rebalancing, emotionally significant, cognitively reappraising social support on the other side of that trauma in these circumstances as well. Or there could be. If you experience a trauma and your mom says, yeah, well, I told you the sky was falling all these years. Glad you fucking caught on. Or provides a shaming environment due to their own psychopathology, or just otherwise isn't available to be supportive for the same reasons, well, that factor is going to move the needle in the wrong direction, hurting the mentality, not helping with healing. And I would also say, if we know that our families are a bit off, if we're aware of their psychiatric disordering, then we're also put in a risky headspace pre-trauma of recognizing that we don't have the support that we need normally, let alone should a dire circumstance present. So once more, individuals may be more stressed to begin with through this awareness, and then the traumatic event is just the cherry on top to create disorder. And this brings us to neurobiological factors. Studies have also identified neurobiological factors that appear to influence resilience, including genetic factors and neurochemical systems involved in the stress response and the function of specific neural networks. Recently, a study was conducted using data from a large longitudinal study of 340 healthy young adult researchers, and it demonstrated that individual differences in threat-related amygdala reactivity predicts psychological vulnerability to life stress occurring 1 to 4 years later. The results of this study are consistent with previous studies that identify risk factors for depression and anxiety disorders in relation to increased amygdala reactivity to threat. Additionally, twin studies of male Vietnam veterans established a genetic influence of about 30% for the vulnerability of PTSD. Researchers have identified genetic markers linked to PTSD by analyzing blood samples from 188 Marines taken before and after deployment into conflict areas. U.S. Marines who developed PTSD symptoms were compared to those who did not. And this way, they identified modules of co-regulated genes involved in innate immune function and interferon signaling. These results were replicated in an independent, smaller sample of 96 Marines. Twin and family studies also provided evidence that most genes that affect the risk of PTSD also influence the risk of other psychiatric disorders, including major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and substance abuse. Our genes become methylated for different degrees of expression thanks to our family's trauma. And I'm sure we've heard of the study where fear of specific scents can be passed on genetically in rat samples in this manner. And also, we don't exactly know what's going on here. We don't know how much the environment could be influencing expression of these markers. Even twins can have entirely different experiences and resulting perceptions, which are then impossible to separate from their role in PTSD development. Or twins might have the same stressed out parents, the same race, gender, sexual experience, education, and established psychopathology. And all of those stressors can pile up organically, socially, to inspire PTSD as well. And to their point, twin and family studies also provided evidence that most genes that affect the risk of PTSD also influence the risk of other psychiatric disorders, major depression, generalized anxiety, and substance abuse. All right, cool. I would and will argue that PTSD commonly includes all of those things. So they may have measured prevalence of transmission of intergenerational PTSD, not interrelatedness of separate mental disorders genetically. And so this concludes the influential pre-traumatic factors: gender, race and ethnicity, age, education and IQ, sexual orientation, pre-trauma psychopathology, prior trauma exposure, familial psychiatric history, and neurobiological factors. These are the background conditions that seem to increase or decrease later risk of PTSD based on correlation. It's very important to note, time and time again, that causation is unclear in these brief discussions that they provide. And often the data, to me, is not what I would consider clean or without socio-psychological explanation. Again and again, we've heard about things that we have no control over, which influence mentality, mindset, emotionality, and most importantly, baseline stress level, just as much as they could directly affect us during traumas. And that psychological aspect of known social and therefore overall life vulnerability, that might be the real threat. Now, onto the peritraumatic factors. During traumas, what seems to draw the line between psychopathology and returning to a healthy homeostasis? Well, they come right out the gate, reiterating what I've been screaming so far today. Peritraumatic factors, trauma type, and severity. Trauma type and severity are important in determining the risk of developing PTSD, whereas the highest PTSD risk is associated with physical injury or sexual assault. However, peritraumatic factors can include the perception of the trauma and how it is experienced by the individual on a cognitive level, as well as on a biological level in terms of the body's stress response. The perception of the trauma as a true threat to one's life and that one has suffered major losses as a result are also associated with greater risk. That's the ticket. You can lose it all and be fine if you're also pretty certain that you will regain it all. You can lose very little and suffer devastating PTSD if you're convinced that what you lost was the Achilles heel to your life, which can shine a light on why the variety of trauma matters so heavily. Physical injury, point blank, is more likely to impact the rest of your life. Feeling like it is a major loss is pretty likely. And the same can be said with sexual trauma. In both cases, the relationship between you and your body becomes damaged. Sense of autonomy, effectiveness, and acceptability are affected. It lasts, perhaps, the rest of your existence. You can get a new home. You can't get a new meat suit or necessarily a new trusting perception of that meat suit. Not to bring this back to me, however, can attest that health and sexual traumas have been some of the most long-lasting and debilitating sources of ongoing stress compared to all the rest. If you lose faith in your system, you lose faith in your ability to navigate life. Overall point being, trauma is perceptual, as they stated, not definite. While trauma type and severity matter, there is no way to compare trauma between individuals or their relative PTSD outcomes, which corresponds nicely with our next and last peritraumatic point. Continued perception of threat. And I'll say these authors jump into this blurb quite strangely, in my opinion. It sounds like I've cut some words out. I have not. However, they bring back a point that we quickly skimmed over last time. Debriefing. Does it end the perception of threat and help prevent PTSD? They say, the ineffectiveness and occasional harmfulness of debriefing as an immediate intervention after disaster or trauma highlight the importance of bending the perception of threat or trauma as soon as possible to maximize the likelihood of adaptive outcomes. The main idea behind debriefing was to promote emotional processing by encouraging recollection of the event versus promoting avoidance and maladaptive emotional outcomes. Debriefing has origins with the military, where sessions were intended to boost morale and reduce distress after a mission. Debriefing was done in a single, mandatory session with 7 stages: introduction, facts, thoughts and impressions, emotional reactions, normalization, planning for future, and disengagement. That sounds nice, right? Look at the military protecting its heroes. They continue without skipping a beat. There are several theories as to why debriefing increases incidence of PTSD. First, those who were likely to develop PTSD were not helped by a single session. Second, being re-exposed too soon to the trauma could lead to re-traumatization. Whereas exposure therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy allow the person to adjust to the stimuli before slowly increasing severity, debriefing did not allow for this. This suggests that the ability to disengage from the traumatic experience and perceive it as over may be an important factor influencing adaptive responses to trauma versus development of PTSD. If the event ends and life moves on normally, that's less likely to create PTSD. If the event happens and then continues to knock over dominoes leading straight off the edge of the table, it's like post-traumatic events never happen. All experiences become peri-traumas in one long string. So stress never subsides, let alone processing beginning. And apparently, debriefing, trying to force the end of an event, is not the solution to this problem. It does not assure anyone that the bad time is over. You are safe now. Probably because that's not true. They can't control what happens after the debriefing, just as much as the debriefing itself was potentially re-traumatizing and too soon to be enlightening. If the person hasn't processed any of the event information for themselves, throwing more data at them isn't going to help. Also, telling them that it's over with and they can move on doesn't allow them to do that, especially when they are still actively in the military. Tell them what happened and give them a sense of normalcy. That is great. But then they walk out of that meeting and still have innumerable unknown threats to deal with. And those probably aren't being discussed as separate events or being psychologically treated as much as necessary. From this point, I think we can take away that it does not help us to do an information dive during or right after we experience a trauma. That is not going to save our psyche. It might only agitate things further, especially if we are not protected from further stress afterwards. All right, that's it for this paper on peritraumatic influences. Severity of the trauma and continued perception of threat are, according to these guys, the peritraumatic factors that make or don't make post-traumatic disordering. But we're dumped here at post-traumatic factors anyways, as they tell us about access to needed resources. Psychological first aid, PFA, is an evidence-informed modular approach for assisting people in the immediate aftermath of disaster and trauma to reduce initial stress and foster short-term and long-term adaptive functioning. It is based on the idea of addressing pragmatic needs. What does the individual need immediately after the trauma? How can their experience be normalized instead of pathologized? And how can they be encouraged to cope effectively? Critical components of PFA include protecting the individual from further harm and providing the perception that the trauma is over. This includes connecting individuals with required services, social services, emergency housing, food, clean clothes, etc. The opportunity to talk without pressure and the presence of active listening, compassion, and addressing and acknowledging concerns contributes to a sense of social support. During PFA, discussion will often include normalizing the individual's emotional responses, discussing possible coping strategies, and relevant referrals. Again, that sounds pretty great. Then they say, it is important to note that despite some smaller preliminary reports, evidence for the efficacy of PFA is currently lacking. Okay, so maybe not that great. So all of this sounds a lot like debriefing. You can inform the individual immediately post-traumatically and try to force psychological welfare up their brainstem. And this does not mean that you are saving them from the onset of PTSD, which, again, can be many months or even years out. Perhaps because people need to process when they're ready. Perhaps because you can't control what then happens after that PFA is administered. A subsequent negative event might cause them to reject the care that was previously provided and revert to an even more stressed out condition. And perhaps PFA isn't very effective because the individual is aware that this is a program, that it doesn't necessarily empower them to feel less at risk or more powerful in their own right, in their own life, in their own circumstances or skin. Long term, maybe they don't feel more protected or confident. Maybe they feel more like charity cases who happened to be assisted. Maybe this actually feels less comforting or contributes to feelings of victimhood being recognized by others. This is a social risk. We don't want to appear as though we're vulnerable to the herd. PFA may be suggesting exactly that. On top of all the reasons that debriefing doesn't work, I think we can categorize PFA the same way. The support that it offers is very different from actual person to person, not a government mandate or some sort of research project. Connection based. Next factor. Social support. Data suggests considerable emotional strength comes from maintaining a social support network. Lack of social support by a spouse, friends, and family after a traumatic event and ongoing life stress also increases the risk of developing PTSD. That second part was pretty important. Ongoing life stress. In recent studies of PTSD in veterans, PTSD was greatly associated with less social support, difficulties in relationships, and poor social functioning. Little to no comment here. We know social support makes life less stressful, and it's inextricable from many of the pre and peri-trauma factors that we've been discussing. Time and again, those aspects were correlated with or indicative of a limited or lacking or less influential social support sphere. As social animals, if you're not estimating yourself to be out here on your own, your brain and body are going to be less stressed all the time. Connective relationships lead, in general, to more positive life outcomes across age groups. And we know that supportive relationship enables emotional and cognitive processing. Perspective support, compassion, and event defragging can all come through organic, individual relationships that we can count on. Leading us to post-trauma cognition, aka cognitive reappraisal. Cognitive flexibility refers to a person's ability to reappraise the perception and experience of the traumatic experience instead of being rigid in one's perception. Being rigid in one's perception makes acceptance and recovery increasingly difficult. Traumatic experiences can be re-evaluated, adjusting the perception and meaningfulness of the event. For example, a person who encounters a traumatic event involving an assault by a man can hold on to the belief that all men are dangerous. This type of inflexibility leads to the development of several PTSD symptoms, such as hyperarousal, hypervigilance, and avoidance. Being open to the idea of acceptance and assimilation of the traumatic event into one's life narrative can lead to recovery. Implications for psychosocial interventions to promote resilience after trauma include cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure therapy, both geared towards modifying cognitions associated with the trauma and enhancing cognitive flexibility as a means of initiating symptom reduction. e.g., reducing avoidance after modifying the core beliefs associated with the trauma. Research studies have demonstrated optimism as being associated with psychosocial well-being in a non-PTSD trial of breast cancer survivors, and with lower post-traumatic symptoms after experiencing a deadly earthquake. Together, optimism and cognitive flexibility provide an individual with faith that they can eventually prevail and survive. Okay, so we finally hear how CBT is connected to trauma resilience after it was so briefly thrown at us in the intro to this series, because it contributes to changing our reactions and perspectives. We don't want to get stuck in our stories or resulting behaviors, which are likely to be rather cataclysmic and extreme during or immediately after a traumatic event. Those narratives make or break us, so we comparatively prosper when we can steer them toward functional and flexible stories that enable the individual to keep living. If your story ends in willful empowerment and some sense of maintained control, stress is reduced and PTSD may be staved away, which isn't necessarily something we can force onto ourselves. However, we can take Wagner's ironic mental control processes into this discussion and say, focusing on trying to rid ourselves of the negative, pessimistic views and mental health outcomes is going to increase their prevalence and impact, making it more likely that that's exactly what we get. So don't focus on signs of pessimism or depression or fear or arousal, or you will bring those things into reality more strongly for your efforts. Focus on creating perspectives that help you, and then test those perspectives in reality over long periods of time to show yourself that they are real, to re-empower you from your core. And as far as other things that we actually can control to help ourselves prevent PTSD, it's back again. Briefly. Physical activity. In contrast to a physically inactive lifestyle, being active is inversely related to stress, physical health problems, and the development of chronic diseases such as PTSD, depression, and substance abuse. Indeed. And again, we can simply say that relationship between self and body makes a big difference. Even after a social trauma, feeling you can rely on your biology is going to be a protective experience versus being incapacitated or medically needy. And on top of that, yeah, biologically, our nervous systems are calmed and nourished by being used for what they exist for. Moving, working, functioning together as complex systems. So, when in doubt, when there's nothing else we feel like we can do, we can care for ourselves in whatever physical ways are accessible, even if that's just going for short walks or stints sitting outside, breathing, stretching, lifting a heavy thing. We can help us by remembering our bodies are here, that they are the conduit between mental and worldly activities, and working with them as such. Just like we can always work towards our final point of the day, embracing a moral compass. Altruism has been strongly associated with resilience in children and adults. Altruistic behavior can contribute to purpose in life. The hopelessness theory of depression has shown that hopelessness and depression can stem from maintaining negative beliefs regarding the stability, globality, and internality of the negative life event that occurred. Conversely, maintaining positive core beliefs may prevent the development of hopelessness by helping the individual adopt a more adaptive way of thinking when faced with traumatic events, aka may boost cognitive reappraisal, like we just discussed. While more empirical study of these ideas is needed in traumatized samples, a study of Pakistani earthquake survivors found that their purpose in life was associated with lower PTSD and depressive symptoms. As we've discussed last time, make positive meaning from the events and maintain a life structure, not by focusing on a job or career, which are both unpredictable, relatively unstable, and not necessarily in line with your core values, but by being consistently engaging in something that feels purposeful to you. Maybe life has changed. But if that life has changed, so you're working on something that emotionally satiates you, that speaks to your soul, big S self thing, then suddenly the event is less of a tragedy and more of a pivotal moment in time. Remembering what matters to you and reorienting towards that thing, that's a PTSD protective factor that spans social support, optimism, even physical welfare, and can include spiritual healing, lifestyle rehabilitation, emotional rehab, psychological recovery, with a side of, was this all meant to happen? To boot. Making a positive out of a negative, bringing the individual into greater alignment with them damn self, and maybe even reducing overall stress by reminding them of all the ultimately unimportant things they were focusing on before the trauma took place so that they can be let go of. All of these factors could be PTSD protective. And a newly tuned moral compass means a more fulfilling direction for the rest of life, a greater life quality. This is going to create more functional, empowered, clarified perspectives. And again, increase, you know it, PTSD resilience. As much as it makes CPTSDers cringe, and we all understand why, it helps the individual's mindset when there's estimated to be a good reason that bad things happened. And that, fuckers, is the rundown from this article, which was very concise until I added all my own thoughts. And what did we learn? There are many factors that we are not in control of, which predispose us to the threat of developing PTSD. That's a reality many of us know all too well. Race, gender, sexual orientation, history of psychopathology, history of PTSD, and all things family, such as their psychiatric disordering and neurobiological contributions, even those contained in our DNA. In this paper, they didn't discuss low socioeconomic status as a risk factor, but we can read between the lines about how it tends to fit in with many other points. And yeah, it's true. We're not able to simply fix those lottery results or the society that makes them stress factors. And also, There are risks and protective factors that we can influence, such as purposely engaging in cognitive reappraisal, exercising our meat robots, maintaining connections that help create a self allowing environment, limiting disassociative hobbies and crutches, looking for endpoints between traumatic events, and avoiding avoidance, masquerading as coping through exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, and narrative formation. These sound like limited points of self assistance, but taken together, they do add up. And on top of all of that, actually kind of great news, knowledge that we are in those aforementioned risky groups we can't control themselves can be a protective or rehabilitation allowing factor itself. Education and prompts for cognitive work, if we recognize that our mindsets and streaming thoughts in the trauma aftermath, they're going to be built on the backs of those psychically threatening conditions, well, then we get a more comprehensive picture of all of the stress we're experiencing, perhaps a great deal of it subconsciously, automatically. And we can work to treat ourselves with more gentle care in light of all of those relevant, logical anxieties, increasing self compassion while also doing the processing work to untangle that new trauma from past and premonitory stresses that are layered within. We can effectively stay with ourselves by knowing all of this. We can see ourselves accurately and tend to those little beans to the extent that we require. Why is a fire event never just a fire event? Because I'm a woman with no right-minded family to lean on, a history of psychiatric disorder, including PTSD, and limited resources. These stress points create a much larger story of danger. They activate the nervous system to a perhaps greater and more severe degree. So there's a little extra weight to there. And I'm willing to bet that any traumatic event you've experienced has been similarly stacked with extra opportunities for mental, emotional, and physical stress. Ones that are easy to miss or exclude from consciousness in appraising what has happened. An abusive relationship isn't just an abusive relationship. A horrible workplace, same. And so it goes. With that realization of the allostatic load we're always working with, we can reparent ourselves more kindly than the first, and let's be honest, maybe 20th time. We can tend to our physical bodies, our emotional experiences, and narratives with more guidance, space, and care than the early events that originally gave us PTSD. And avoid another round of it through recognizing our power, our control, our educations and IQs to make an impact on our own experience, now and every year into the future, without needing even one more paper to tell us that it's possible. And not only is it allowed, but it is accountable to ourselves and the people we love to do the hard work of post-traumatic processing, meaning finding, and self-care, slowly and with compassion. Compassion you may not have been issuing to yourself this whole time, recognizing all of the stresses and anxieties and risk factors that you're facing day after day. Technically, peri-trauma or not. No one knows what perspective we already carry or the new information that will be laid over the top of it. And a lot of us aren't aware of everything that is included in that perspective that we're holding already either. It's impossible to predict how anyone will be affected by anything because most of the pre-trauma, peri-trauma, and post-traumatic considerations that we've been discussing are impossible to separate from each other. Even before a trauma, we can anticipate what a trauma will be like for us in our own personal life circumstances versus our innate societal and material challenges. And even before a trauma, we can anticipate how our lives will rebound or ail in the aftermath of challenges. That is the baseline stress load that we all carry. Trauma is perceptual. It's all about where you come from and where you estimate you're going. It's about the stories we can and can't tell ourselves. All of these discussed factors over the past 2 episodes drastically affect the prior understandings and future outlooks of the individuals, which are then elevating or stunting stress responses pre-trauma, which will affect stress levels peri-trauma, and also the ongoing physical disturbance post-trauma. Time is nonlinear, and so is the human capacity for looking ahead, deducing what is likely, and becoming truly mentally and physically stressed or supported by those predilections. What we come from matters. Where we estimate we might possibly be going matters. How we view where we came from as it influences our ability to prosper into the future might be most important of all. And with that, have you listened to that perspective series from 2022 in which we came to this same conclusion? Post-traumatic stress disorder is about the impact on our bodies, our brains, and therefore our beings through the storylines that we find ourselves on. Not about the measurable effects that protect or predispose an individual to PTSD. Not about traumatic variety, severity, or load, as it can be measured and very briefly reduced in a paper. From all of this, I have to say, as much as possible, write the best story that you can. Be flexible with that story, tend to your biology, and pass the information on with progeny and purpose. Cheers, fuckers, and I'll talk to you soon.